Très bien, alors on va commencer. Bonsoir à toutes et à tous. Je suis Oussama Laraichi des écologistes du Midwest. Une fois n'est pas coutume, nous sommes très heureux de vous retrouver ce soir pour un nouveau webinaire de sujets passionnants en ligne avec nos valeurs. Ce soir, nous aborderons la réappropriation des espaces urbains à travers les circuits courts, la permaculture et les produits locaux. Mais avant de laisser la parole à nos panélistes, nous tenions à vous faire part de notre candidature, aujourd'hui officielle, à l'élection consulaire de mai prochain. Réunis autour de notre liste des écologistes du Midwest et du Kentucky, et avec le soutien d'Europe Écologie Les Verts, nous nous apprêtons à vous proposer une alternative écologiste autour d'une gauche rassemblée pour la représentation de notre belle communauté à travers les responsabilités des conseillers des Français de l'étranger. À l'instar de nos webinaires, nous mènerons une campagne d'idées et de valeurs sur lesquelles nous bâtirons nos propositions pour les Françaises et Français établis dans les 13 États couverts par la circonscription consulaire de Chicago. L'élection n'est bien sûr pas une fin en soi. Elle se veut le catalyseur de notre dynamique afin que cette dernière grandisse et perdure. Alors je vous invite toutes et à tous à nous rejoindre, à enrichir notre groupe par vos idées, vos parcours, vos expériences. N'hésitez pas à nous contacter sur les différentes plateformes de communication dont on dispose, notre site web et nos réseaux sociaux. Coming back to our webinar, I am delighted for our first bilingual event, a very dear and important step towards the inclusiveness of our campaign. Indeed, building an inclusive community is at the forefront of our activism. So I want to introduce our moderator for tonight, Johan Charlet. Johan lives in St. Paul, Minnesota, and is a member of Les Écologistes du Midwest, as well as a member of our running ticket for the upcoming election. Without Johan, we would not be here tonight. So thank you for pulling this together, for gathering such an amazing panel, and for being an instrumental member of our group. Without further ado, I am going to hand it over to you, Johan, to present our panelists and our topics for tonight. Johan, the floor is yours.
Merci Oussama. Et merci à tous les panélistes ce soir de nous rejoindre. Donc ce soir, comme Oussama l'a dit, ce sera en deux langues. La première partie, avec ma femme Kate, sera en français. Et ensuite, nous aurons George et Mike qui nous parleront en anglais de leur aventure dans leur jardin, ici à Minneapolis. Et ensuite, Jeff, aussi en anglais, nous dira comment il a fait pour faire du vin à partir de fruits non utilisés dans les quartiers ici. Tous les panélistes de ce soir sont ici au Minnesota et je les remercie vivement de nous accorder leur temps et leur énergie pour ce webinaire de ce soir. Donc, on va commencer avec Kate Charlet. Kate cherche constamment à améliorer et à élargir ses jardins, ainsi que ses connaissances écologiques. Elle est titulaire d'un certificat de design en permaculture et fondatrice, manager du Garden Farm à Fuzzy Bottom. Elle vit à Saint Paul, Minnesota, où elle fait grandir ses jardins. Elle est partie de quelques mètres carrés et maintenant, elle est à plus de 1700 mètres carrés au fil des années. Dans sa quête pour plus d'harmonie avec son écosystème, Kate continue son apprentissage pratique en agriculture régénérative et aime partager ses connaissances avec son entourage. C'est à toi, Kate.
D'accord, merci Johan et Oussama et les écolos du Midwest d'avoir organisé cet webinaire. Comme Johan a dit, je m'appelle Kate Charlet, j'habite à Saint Paul, Minnesota, je suis maraîchère. Et bon, je suis d'origine du Minnesota, mais je suis aussi citoyenne française. Et j'ai vécu en France, en Bretagne, pendant 2 ans. Et comme une bonne étudiante américaine en France, en rentrant, j'ai éteint mon quota et j'ai ramené un Français aux États-Unis avec moi. Alors, et c'est grâce à lui que je suis là ce soir pour vous parler de mes aventures du jardinage et de la permaculture. J'espère que ça va vous intéresser un peu, mais que surtout, ça va vous encourager à mettre vos mains, dans la terre. Alors, je vais partager mon écran ici. Attends. Voilà. Et d'accord. Bon, alors, ça c'est mon lieu de travail maintenant. Alors, comment est-ce que quelqu'un, avec vraiment, aucune connaissance, en jardinage, a finir à être jardinier, de ça? Bah, bonne question. C'est une histoire, et le début commence, il y a à peu près, 10 ans. Moi et quelques collègues, on a plaisanté et commencé à imaginer une vie, différente, sans bureau, sans rendez-vous, sans chef, sur un grand terrain avec un joli potager, des chèvres, des poules, bah, et travailler pour nous-mêmes au lieu des autres. Une vraie rêverie, quoi. Bon, on était allés même, jusque donner des rôles à chacun, machin, allait être animateur et s'occuper des visites guidées, l'autre allait s'occuper des animaux, ce couple-là était en charge des cuisines et moi, c'était les jardiniers. Bah, clairement, parce que j'ai eu 3 pauvres petites tomates et un basilic, donc oui, j'étais l'experte. Bon, oh, ça on s'est bien amusés et ça nous a bien fait rire, mais finalement, un de nos amis, couple a déménagé vers la côte est et on a fini par dire, que notre rêve allait arriver, when pigs fly, ou comme j'ai appris, l'autre jour, quand les poules auront des dents. Donc voilà, la vraie vie continue. On travaille, on s'occupe de la famille, mais pendant le week-end, je fais de plus en plus de jardinage. Je découvre, des livres et des vidéos sur la permaculture, qui m'attirent, de plus en plus. Surtout parce que je voyais dans cette rubrique, de la permaculture une manière de réunir, et de lier, des différentes valeurs et intérêts, que j'avais dans ma vie. Alors je me suis plongée et j'ai décidé, j'allais m'inscrire dans un cours de permaculture. Alors, bon d'abord, je pense qu'il faut que je vous parle un petit peu de la permaculture, parce qu'il me semble que le mot, est souvent entendu et utilisé, mais rarement expliqué ou, compris. Bon, il y a une raison pour ça. C'est pas facile à communiquer vraiment, dans une phrase, bah, qu'est-ce que c'est? C'est un peu compliqué. Heu et même, ceux qui le pratiquent, sont pas souvent d'accord sur, comment le définir. Donc je vais essayer de vous donner une idée, une petite, très petite idée, mais peut-être un petit peu plus claire. Alors ceci est, mon interprétation. Alors, la permaculture, c'est, un système holistique de design, pour créer une communauté, une société, une culture, ou même un monde ou une personne, tout simplement, durable. Et il est basé sur 3 éthiques, prendre soin de la terre, prendre soin des humains et redistribuer des excédents à la terre et aux humains. Ça, c'est souvent appelé, le partage équitable. Alors la permaculture, n'est pas simplement un système d'agriculture, ou de jardinage, bien que ses racines viennent de là. Aujourd'hui, la permaculture est élargie et répandue et dans plusieurs domaines. Maintenant, c'est souvent, décrit comme une philosophie, de vie. Bon, si la permaculture, vous intéresse, je vous encourage d'aller visiter, ce site, Permacultural Principles, où ils ont écrit, une petite introduction, en français et je trouve que c'est bien fait. Alors, on retourne à mon histoire. En 2016, j'ai suivi mon cours de design, en permaculture, avec, Wayne Wiseman. Le cours a eu lieu, dans le Wisconsin, où j'ai eu la grande chance, de passer 10 jours à Keystone Academy of Applied Permaculture. Maintenant, c'est simplement Keystone. C'est un endroit, endroit de reconstruction de la terre et de l'humain. Et c'est vraiment quelque chose à voir et à visiter. Bon, pour moi, le plus grand plus de ce séjour était l'ouverture à une autre voie possible. Cette expérience m'a permis d'imaginer un autre monde possible et de commencer à mettre mes pieds dans une autre manière de vivre. Jusque-là, j'avais toujours suivi des règles, bon, à peu près. Et j'ai fini mes diplômes et j'ai trouvé une carrière. Bah, j'ai changé un peu, mais bon, je restais dans le chemin. Et maintenant, j'ai commencé à penser, bah, pourquoi pas? Est-ce que j'ai vraiment besoin de continuer sur ce chemin? Alors, finalement, après ça, je suis rentrée et Yoran et moi, on a enlevé la pelouse sur le côté de la rue devant notre maison, enfin, le côté public. Alors, gros acte de révolution. Nos voisins, ils vont croire qu'on est fous, ils nous détester, on est en train de faire ça. Ça, c'est notre maison avant. Maison typique, bien, voilà, simple. Et voilà, nous, on a enlevé la pelouse et on a ajouté une extension de gouttière pour que l'eau puisse être absorbée par notre terrain au lieu de juste aller couler dans la rue. Et avec ça, on a creusé une rigole de drainage en forme de triskel. On peut voir une partie de ça ici. C'est pas fini encore, mais voilà, c'est là. Et on a ajouté des plantes vivaces et quelques légumes annuels. Et des plantes pour les pollinisateurs. Et voilà un jardin qui produisent et qu'on n'a pas besoin d'être tendu. Alors imaginez, au lieu de passer une demi-heure, 1 heure à tondre votre pelouse tous les week-ends, vous pouvez juste sortir pour récolter des herbes ou des fruits ou des fleurs. C'est génial. Et je pense que George et Mike, qui vont présenter ce soir, après, ils peuvent bien le confirmer. Alors débarrassez-vous de vos pelouses et vous ne regretterez pas. Bon, là, chez nous, on a encore plein de travail, plein de projets. Voilà, ça c'est un peu de la jardin d'avant encore. Mais on a reçu des nouvelles. Et bon, est-ce que vous vous souvenez de mes collègues de travail? Bon, Karen et Nick, c'est des amis, ils ont acheté 4 hectares de terrain agricole qu'ils ont surnommé Fuzzy Bottom. Ils m'ont proposé de faire un potager et j'ai dit, bah ok, pourquoi pas. Et voilà la naissance du Garden Farm à Fuzzy Bottom. Bon, d'accord, il faut que j'explique aussi pourquoi Fuzzy Bottom, enfin pourquoi Garden Farm. En gros, on est entre deux mondes, la ville et la campagne. Fuzzy Bottom est situé à Hugo, au Minnesota, c'est presque 35 km nord-est des villes de Saint Paul et Minneapolis. Alors, pour les gens de la ville, c'est une ferme, mais pour les gens à la campagne, c'est un jardin. Et bon, c'est aussi un garden farm parce que mon style de travailler à la main ressemble plus à notre idée commune de jardinage. Mais les récoltes pardon, sont souvent au niveau d'une petite ferme plus qu'un potager de la ville. D'où vient Garden Farm. Voilà. Alors, on retourne à cette photo-là. Alors, le jardin, c'est à peu près 1700 mètres carrés. Ça n'a pas l'air énorme jusqu'au moment où il faut le désherber à la main. Là, j'ai besoin de travailleurs. Et pour ça, j'ai moi et Johan les week-ends. Et les amis et la famille viennent nous aider de temps en temps. Alors, qu'est-ce que c'est la différence par rapport à un maraîcher typique de ce que je fais là dans mon jardin? Bah, déjà, vous voyez que c'est pas tout droit. Il n'y a pas que les rangées rectangulaires, il y a des spirales, des formes. Et c'est aussi ma façon de travailler, comme j'ai dit avant, c'est un peu différent. Je travaille à la main. Je ne retourne pas la terre. Il n'y a pas d'additions chimiques comme des pesticides, fertilisants. Et j'essaie de mettre plein de biodiversité dans les plantes et dans l'organisation et les emplacements aussi des plantes. Voilà, il y a un mélange de plantes vivaces avec des annuelles. Bon, alors pourquoi est-ce que j'ai choisi de rendre ma vie plus difficile et faire le travail à la main? Bah, ça nous ramène à la permaculture et sa première éthique, prendre soin de la terre. Quand j'utilise une brouette, enfin, tout simplement une brouette ou une pelle, mes propres muscles ou peut-être celle de mon mari, je ne consomme pas de pétrole. Voilà, mieux pour la terre. Bon, je suis pas tout à fait une puriste non plus. J'ai plein de boulot à faire et pas de temps illimité. Donc le pragmatisme est aussi un truc, qui me plaît bien dans la permaculture. On utilise chez nous, on utilise un tracteur, pour tondre les chemins, tourner le compost et mettre des gros tas de matériaux, dans les jardins, par exemple. Donc je ne retourne pas la terre, du tout. Bon, on a fait une fois au début, c'est là que vous voyez là dans la photo, parce que c'était bien compacté, par l'agriculture qui était là, avant. Mais je ne retourne plus et j'ajoute du compost par-dessus mes carrés et je paillis et le printemps, c'est bon pour planter. C'est tout. Alors autrement, pardon, ça voilà, ça c'est une autre manière de prendre soin de la terre, c'est de ne pas relabourer et autrement, j'utilise aucun produit chimique, comme j'ai dit, ni pesticides, ni fertilisants. Je pense que j'ai pas besoin d'élaborer sur ce point-là. Je pense qu'on sait tout pourquoi on n'a pas envie de faire ça pour prendre soin de la terre. Il y a aussi la biodiversité chez moi. La majorité de mes plantes sont des légumes annuels, mais quand je les plante et je les mélange, avec des fleurs, des herbes et même des fois avec les plantes, vivaces, et des mauvaises herbes. Il y a des mauvaises herbes dans mon jardin, il y en a plein et des fois je les laisse parce qu'eux aussi ils apportent quelque chose, de bien pour les plantes. Alors je crois, vraiment dans la mixité. Ça encourage les pollinisateurs et ça embête les pestes. En parlant de pollinisateurs, il y a aussi des parcelles, avec des plantes, uniquement pour les attirer dans les jardins et j'ai aussi planté, 2 parcelles, avec des fleurs, des herbes de la prairie pour retourner, un peu du terrain, à son état naturel. Voilà, un peu de biodiversité encore. Alors, qu'est-ce que c'est le bénéfice de tout ça? Bah, la récolte, bien sûr. C'est la première bénéfice, et nous aide, à prendre soin, des humains et aussi de faire un peu de partage équitable. Principalement, ces légumes nourrissent, nous, Johan et moi, Karen et Nick, pour toute l'année. Après, ils vendent une partie à la famille, des amis, des voisins, des autres gens du quartier. J'ai une glacière devant notre maison, qui est dans la deuxième photo là. Heu, bon, j'ai mis là pour ce qui passe devant, notre maison, pendant la promenade. Il peut prendre, une tomate pour leur dîner, et je remplis ça avec de la nourriture, le long de l'été et l'automne. Je mets des annonces aussi sur les réseaux sociaux, pour vendre, quand j'ai vraiment beaucoup et si j'ai une récolte trop grand pour tout ça, je donne, à une banque alimentaire, locale. Alors, voilà, tout le monde se demande, bah, qu'est-ce que c'est des chiffres? Comment est-ce que ça marche? Voilà. Franchement, j'ai pas des chiffres de combien de ça et ça on a. J'ai pas le temps de faire. Je suis désolée, mais bon, voilà une liste, de tous les produits, qui sortent, du jardin. Mais c'est grand cette liste, mais la récolte, est loin, d'être le seul bénéfice. Pour nous, Johan et moi, on profite pleinement de ce changement de vie. On a une meilleure santé pour nous et aussi pour la terre. On mange une meilleure qualité de produits. Et franchement, le goût de la nourriture vraiment fraîche du jardin, ça peut pas être battu, hein. Il y a une énorme différence. Une autre truc, c'est qu'on n'achète plus de légumes et moins de fruits et d'épices des grandes surfaces. Une autre bénéfice, c'est le mouvement. C'est intégré dans notre vie maintenant. On n'a plus besoin de trouver le temps ou les désirs d'aller dans une salle de sport. L'activité physique, c'est une partie du système, du design de notre vie. On a aussi gagné dans la catégorie de santé mentale, surtout en 2020, de pouvoir sortir et faire un travail physique et respirer. C'était énorme. Et en réalité, ça fait un grand bien tous les ans. On a retrouvé plus de plaisir dans les choses simples, comme regarder les oiseaux dans notre jardin, des papillons qui visitent. Donc une vraie reconnexion avec la nature. Et on passe plus de temps dehors. Et ça fait un bien incroyable. Un autre bénéfice, c'est qu'on produit moins de déchets. Moins de déchets en plastique qui vient avec la nourriture achetée dans les grandes surfaces. On n'a pas de déchets de nourriture parce que tout ça va à la compost et ça nourrit les plantes. Mais bon, quand vous faites le travail de pousser tous ces trucs vous-même, toutes ces nourritures vous-même, croyez-moi, vous gaspillez beaucoup moins. Donc déjà ça. Et le meilleur bénéfice pour moi, personnellement, était de retrouver une fierté en soi et dans ses efforts. De produire quelque chose physique qui a une vraie valeur. On peut le manger. Tout ça en aidant la terre au lieu de les détruire. Et ça n'a pas de prix pour moi. Mais encore, il y a des bénéfices pour des autres aussi, pour nos voisins, pour notre famille, pour nos amis. Ils ont l'accès aussi à une nourriture plus saine, avec plus de goût. Ils peuvent profiter de la beauté de notre jardin avec ses fleurs et ses animaux qui les rendent visite. Mais le plus important, c'est que, au moins j'espère, qu'eux aussi, ils voient les possibilités. Ils voient l'idée d'une autre manière et d'un autre monde possible. Bon, maintenant, c'est à vous. D'accord, c'est pas nécessaire de complètement changer vos vies, mais plantez quelque chose qui vous fait plaisir. Observez la nature autour de vous. Même dans les villes, il y a des merveilles à voir. Marchez pieds nus dans vos jardins et touchez la terre. Merci de votre attention.
Merci à toi, Kate. Et c'est clairement une aventure que nous avons commencée il y a 5 ans. Je suis vraiment fier du chemin accompli tous les deux et grâce à toute notre famille et tous nos amis. Et je suis vraiment content qu'on puisse partager ça avec tout le monde sur ce webinaire. Donc, merci encore. And special thanks to Roger Bollenhover, who's on this webinar as well. Thanks for joining us. So thanks to Kelly's friends and Kelly's family for helping us on this journey. And we really appreciate it. And we love the way we're living right now. Et juste pour finir avec cette présentation, je dirais à tout le monde, comme Kate a dit, n'hésitez pas à vous lancer, même si c'est juste un pot de terre avec une plante que vous mettez près d'une fenêtre. Ça commence tout petit et puis finalement, vous ferez pousser de plus en plus de choses qui vont vous aider à cuisiner et à améliorer votre vie en général. Donc, nous allons passer à la deuxième présentation. Avant que je continue, donc je rappelle à tout le monde que vous pouvez poser des questions par le chat, donc en Q&A. Et à la fin de cette présentation, une fois que les 3 présentations seront finies, nous liserons les questions et nos panélistes pourront y répondre. Donc, notre prochaine présentation est George and Mike au Urban Farm. Leur aventure à eux est née quand ils ont décidé, comme nous, de se débarrasser de la pelouse devant leur maison et de la remplacer par un potager. Ce simple acte a entraîné de nombreux changements positifs dans leur vie et ils accompagnent maintenant les autres à transformer leur terrain urbain en ferme urbaine. Leur but est d'inspirer les communautés urbaines à mener une vie plus saine et plus durable à travers un lien social plus significatif. Ils accompagnent notamment des individus dans la culture de leurs propres aliments biologiques jusqu'à la production de leur propre électricité. So now we have a presentation from George and Mike. Thanks for joining us, George and Mike. You can start whenever you're ready.
George, Mike, you guys are muted. Sorry to interrupt.
I was just saying, thank you so much for inviting us. We're thrilled to be here. Neither of us speak or read a word of French, but we know enough that we could read that list of delicious food that was at the end of Katie's presentation.
Some of it very similar to Spanish, so that helped us out too. So, I'm George, by the way.
And I am Mike, and we are our urban farms. And we have to say right off, we love doing presentations like this, but we have to be upfront and say that when we coined the name Our Urban Farms, it was really just a personal joke between the two of us. You know, all we really started out doing was planting a little garden in our front yard in our little Minneapolis house. And I'm going to give you, start out by showing you what we're doing a little bit, by showing you kind of the space that we're talking about here. This is a satellite view of our home in Minneapolis. You know, it's a small little urban lot. You know, it's one of the smaller lots in Minneapolis, honestly, so it's really tiny. And the whole backyard is covered by a large oak tree and a garage. And so the only place that we're talking about growing here is really a portion of the front yard and a small little space on the side yard, the south side of the house.
Yeah, an urban farm conjures some huge acreage. We're really talking about something that's really tiny, but we are amazed at how much diversity we've been able to create over the years, how much we're able to grow, and how much we're able to learn. And the transformation that's taken place in our life and in our gardening.
And how the simple act of planting a garden has fundamentally changed the way we live, you know, in our neighborhood and particularly in our homes. So we're really excited to share our story with you. But you can see here, down here in the south side of the house, there's just this little area for tomatoes and peppers. We have other herbs and vegetables and berries in this area. And then this area is all just patio and flowers. And then the rest of the yard is for chickens and dog space, and it's all shady. So what we started with, this is a kind of before and after of our home. On the top left over here, this is really our house, this teeny little yard, just a postage stamp of a place with this very shady backyard with no fencing or anything. And in the end, we've really converted it over to be this lush, beautiful growing space. And I think it's funny, you know, when we talk about gardening, one of the very first things that we were worried about was, you know, what would the neighbors think, you know, removing all the lawn and putting in, you know, vegetables, what would the neighbors think? But, you know, in the end, I think it's so much more beautiful with all the vegetables and things growing than it did with this ugly monoculture that, you know, where, you know, we could get into details about where our ideas of aesthetics come from, but we decided that the grass was high maintenance. It was causing a large footprint to take care of. We didn't enjoy doing it. And so we really just started this entire effort because George wanted to get rid of the lawnmower.
Yeah, it was one of the best days of my life when I hauled those things off to the thrift store. I felt free that day.
Yeah. And so, and we were fortunate that we had lived here for a long time without using any lawn chemicals, but we also, you know, understand that a lot of people do use them, and transitioning to urban farming is a great way to also get rid of toxic chemicals, especially in neighborhoods around here. We're just 2 blocks from the Mississippi River, and we worry about what's coming from people's yards and going right into the Mississippi River and then right down to the Gulf of Mexico. So what we do, we realize through this process, what we do in our yards has a dramatic impact far beyond the boundaries of our yard. And in the end, what we ended up growing in that tiny little space are tomatoes. And combined with a little extra purchasing from our CSA, our community supported agriculture, we get enough tomatoes to can a year's supply of sauces, salsas, and pastes. Really about 40 quarts plus about 2 dozen pints and a large number of half-pint pastes. Peppers that we freeze and dry.
Yep. Throughout the year. Garlic as well, about 80 to 100 heads we plant. Typically we plant at least 4 varieties, sometimes 5. And green beans, the same with that. We usually plant at least 2. Now we're up to 3 different varieties of those as well. Many different kinds of greens, mostly around kale. Kale seems to grow in cold climates like ours really well. I've been amazed that I've gone out there with snow in the ground in November and still been able to pick kale off of the plants out there. So it's pretty hardy for us. And then potatoes, we have a novel way of planting and harvesting our potatoes, which we'll show you because of our space limitations. Instead of going out, we go up. So we're getting as creative as we can with our space that we have.
We also grow chamomile and other herbs and spices for cooking, for teas. Our favorite summer beverage is chamomile mint tea, which is just heavenly, made into an iced tea. We have blueberries, raspberries, blackberries, red currants. We get peaches and cherries from our CSA to mix with our blueberries. So we have jam for miles. In our little raspberry patch, which George mostly manages, we'll get anywhere from, it says on the list, 80 to 100 half-pint jars of raspberry. Talk about permaculture. The berries, the raspberries, blackberries, blueberries in this area are largely native, and they produce like wild, and it's excellent food.
Just a couple of principles that we tried to apply to the selection of what we wanted to grow. Obviously, we're a cold weather climate, and so the garden only lasts for a certain portion of the year. And so we were intent on creating things that we could store and can to get us through the winter time here when things aren't growing outside. That's one thing. The other thing is that we do belong to a community supported agriculture farm, a CSA. And so we didn't want to duplicate, we wanted to complement the kinds of things that we get from them as well. So those are 2 principles that we really tried to apply to our garden.
And that's how we decide what we're going to grow. And what we've done in this space is just really unbelievably spectacular. Our tomatoes are just gigantic and sweet and tasty. We've never used a chemical on our lawn, and all through harvesting season, our counter in our kitchen will be just piled with all of this fresh produce. And again, all of those tomatoes and things we ultimately just cook down into sauces and pastes. And by the end of our growing season, our pantry is literally just jam-packed full. Our freezer in our basement and upstairs are jam-packed full. And all of the berries have been harvested and made into jams. And we are ready to go into our fall season with almost a year's supply of food in our house. And again, this is from a really tiny space. And while we do supplement with the CSA, we get a massive amount of food from our garden. Fall garlic harvest is one of my favorite times of year. You know, we'll pull up those 100 heads of garlic, and I'm a garlic addict. I just love that stuff. And I just have to say, if you've never tasted fresh garlic that hasn't been dried or cured, you just don't know what garlic tastes like. And, you know, so I'm thinking sometime soon we need to start organizing like our own local version of a garlic harvest festival around the end of July, because it is a really fun day when we go out and pull all that garlic up. The whole yard and the house just smells like garlic, and it's just a wonderful, fun thing. Can you tell I like garlic?
This is us
putting together our potato cages.
Yes. We actually move that fast. We don't.
What we're doing is we're putting layers of straw, soil, potato seeds, compost, straw, soil, potato seeds, compost, so that we're raising these towers to grow potatoes vertically. The vines end up coming out the sides of those cages and out the top, and you end up with these beautiful lush cages over on the right with beautiful vines growing potatoes, and inside those cages they're just packed with potatoes. And because you've put all of that lovely dirt and compost and straw in those bins that ends up growing and kind of breaking down through the summer, that becomes a rich topsoil that you can literally just open those cages up and dump the cages out over your garden as a soil amendment for the following year. It's just, there are wonderful things to grow. You're not just growing potatoes, you're growing topsoil. Our beans, we grow bush beans like this, and we also grow pole beans, and we end up with enough in the freezer to last a full year. My favorite beans are these dragon tongues, which are these large, thick, meaty beans, but they're also super crisp and very, very sweet. And, you know, I'm sorry, you cannot eat a bean that is as delicious as one fresh picked out of your garden. You just, like, as soon as you pick it, it starts to reduce its flavor just a little bit. And so eating them fresh and blanching them fresh is just the way to go. We've also put in some flowers, particularly to help our local pollinators. We have leaf cutter bees and mason bees and hundreds and hundreds or thousands of other little pollinators that we're providing additional food and forage for throughout our garden to help benefit the food plants that we grow as well. And we've started putting up, this is a mason bee house that we've put up. We now have many of them, and they're very active and very busy. And we're just thrilled with how the garden has helped us reconnect to nature.
There's even a bird's nest that got formed on top of it. So it's built beyond that.
Our chamomile patch is thick and lush, and it's so much chamomile that we have our neighbors come and pick their own tea all summer long, and it's just beautiful and lovely.
Lots of greens, different kinds of variety. This is just a sample of the canning of jam that I do every year. And we even have added, as of last year, a new plant, our cherry tree. This is a northern variety that we planted. I think it's called a North Star, developed here at the University of Minnesota. That was our total harvest last year. One cherry, but it was delicious. And we're hoping for more this year.
The tree came back and it's got lots of buds on it this spring. So we're hoping that it'll take off and we'll have a nice little cherry tree. But in the end, we started out to start a simple garden so that we could get rid of our grass in the front yard. But in the end, we got so much more out of it than we could possibly imagine.
Yeah. Neither of us has any kind of a horticulture gardening background. We never grew up on a farm. We grew up in the suburbs. And so all of this has been learning little by little, talking to people, reading things, connecting with organizations, connecting to just learn as much as we can.
Connecting with other neighbors who have gardens.
Yeah.
And so it's really, because of all those things, it really has changed our life. It dramatically reduced our carbon footprint, got rid of all of our lawn care, helped us learn more about food, helped us reconnect and learn more about nature, helped us feel more connected to our neighborhood and our neighbors and our own food system. It's obviously saved us a ton of money in food. When we go to the grocery store, there's only a handful of things that we ever buy. And it's led us to include other changes in our lives. We've added solar power to our house now. So we are now a solar powered home. We're now biking instead of
year-round bicyclist,
sold
which
our car.
in Minnesota is a very challenging thing.
And we've added chickens about a year ago, we added chickens to the garden, which has really sort of helped us feel a completion of the growing cycle. The chickens help us quite a bit, and it's ended up changing our diets in other ways. It's added sourdough baking to our lives, and canning and coffee roasting. And just a couple of notes about our chickens. I have heard for so long that that any sort of animals on your farm can help you grow more food. And I never understood it until we actually got our chickens. And the way they benefit us is obviously through eggs. But more importantly, they manufacture compost that can go right into our garden. We don't have to buy all these soil amendments. And they actually do the work of mixing the compost into the soil for us. So we just gently scatter the compost around and turn the chickens loose in the garden, and they get busy scratching and pecking and digging it and turning it up into the topsoil to make this really rich growing medium that is impossible to duplicate without them. So they really help us close the energy cycle of the garden. And just a note, if you're going to mix chickens and gardens together, we have to say, you can't put the chickens in the garden after you've planted. The chickens can only be there after you've harvested and before planting, because digging and rooting around and pulling things up is what they do. And just a final note about our lawns collectively. As a society, we run around thinking that these green lawns are sort of some kind of like manicured perfection that we all strive for. But to get there, we are pumping them full of toxic herbicides, insecticides, and fertilizers that are all going right into our Mississippi River and down, or whatever your watershed is. And they're high maintenance and they're not helpful. And we can do so much better. In the United States alone, there are 50 million acres of lawn. I mean, think about that, 55 million. The state of Minnesota's total size is 55 million acres. We could literally cover the entire state of Minnesota, including lakes, with lawn. What we're doing to those lawns is important, not just for our own health, but for the health of the planet. And this process has helped us learn that, and has helped us to take ownership of the little piece of land that is ours. And we are thrilled that we changed it, and we would never go back. And we invite everyone to join us and learn more about how you can do that at oururbanfarms.com.
Thanks a lot, George and Mike. Very interesting presentation, and there are a lot of things in common with you and with what you did and what we did. And it's really great, the feeling of just picking one fruit one year, and the next year you have so many fruits you don't even know what to do with. So it's an amazing feeling to grow your own food, and just keep the produce aisle when you're in the grocery store, and just go get other stuff as you need. Ok, notre prochaine présentation est par Jeff. Jeff Seidler est propriétaire et vigneron. Il a commencé à fabriquer du cidre dans son dortoir de l'Université du Minnesota il y a presque 30 ans. Et en améliorant ses recettes continuellement, sans ne jamais compromettre sur la qualité des ingrédients, Urbains continue de produire des vins et cidres à partir de fruits locaux. Chaque été et automne, avec la permission des propriétaires des terrains, ils cueillent des pommes, des poires, des prunes et cerises sur les arbres fruitiers des résidents et dans les vergers locaux. La rhubarbe, le pissenlit, le houblon et les autres fleurs de saison sont également récoltés pour produire leurs délicieuses boissons. Jeff, whenever you're ready, you can show us how you're producing wine.
Yes, thank you, Johan. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, great. And I will start screen sharing. I do not, George and Mike, I loved your presentation. I do not have anything nearly that well organized. I will share some photos of what I do because it's pretty unusual. I have a lot of people asking me about this. And so I guess I've gotten good at talking about it, but I haven't been good enough to actually make a formal presentation. I just like to talk. So that's what I'll do. I'm going to talk. I think Johan covered a little bit of what our history is at Urban Forage. I started out making wine very badly when I was 19 in my dorm room because I just wanted to make alcohol at that time. I was in college, and I wasn't concerned about quality. I was concerned about making booze, and I used what was locally available. That was apple juice at the grocery store. I went to the grocery store, found some bread yeast, put it into the apple juice, and made some hard cider. And though the results weren't that good from my first batch, actually they're awful, terrible. Didn't matter because I kept, well, it mattered, but I kept on doing it as a hobby, just informally for fun, all through my young adulthood into adulthood. And at the same time, I went back to school a couple of times and became a landscape architect. That was my regular job. I worked at an architecture firm as a landscape architect. I designed lawns and gardens and parking lots, things like that, and thought I would be doing that for the rest of my life. As it turned out, during the Great Recession, I was laid off from my job and had to decide, had to figure out something else to do. And my dream for many years had been to be a winemaker, a cider maker, a winemaker, as a profession. And right now, Jay, I'm on, not now. So I decided that was the time to do it. That was this time to take the leap when I no longer had a regular job. But my wife and I did not have a vineyard. We didn't have an orchard. We didn't have any great resources for that matter. We did have an empty building on Lake Street. We had a almost falling down building on Lake Street that I started fixing up. And I turned my hobby of collecting unwanted apples or unwanted fruit in general and turning it into cider and wine into a job. And that's what Urban Forage was. I started collecting apples from people's backyards. I collected pears. I collect plums, cherries. I also collect dandelions and apricots if I can find them. And I've now worked out an agreement with the owner of a vineyard in the suburbs. I maintain 80-year-old woman's vineyard out in the suburbs. This will be my third year doing it, and in return for the grapes. So she has no interest in the grapes. She just loves having a vineyard. She's retired, has no need for the grapes, but she wants the vineyard to look nice. So I maintain the vineyard for her. I pick the grapes in the fall, and everybody's happy. No money changes hands. I give her some wine the next year, but it's a way of foraging grapes, which I thought I'd never be able to forage. People just don't grow grapes on in their backyard typically. But I've found a way. Actually, she came to me and asked me to maintain her vineyard. So that's what I do now. Maintain vineyards, pick people's backyards. You'll see here in the picture, this is one of the rural orchards that I pick. It's my winemaker, Eric, shaking the tree with a 16-foot long pole. We have a long pole with a hook on the end. You'll see underneath the tree, there's tarps spread out. We shake the apples onto tarps, and then you'll see bins spread over the tarp. We pick up the ends of the tarp, push the apples into the middle of the tarp, and then shake them into the bin. And we bring them back to our winery in South Minneapolis, in a very urban area. You're probably not familiar with South Minneapolis, but it's a built up, fairly densely built up area. And we have a small building, but there's a 20-foot by 10-foot space in the back where we have processing equipment, and we process the apples in the back of the building into cider, and then ferment it in the basement of the building. I'm going to try to open some more pictures here to show you. Here's the vineyard. Here's my nieces and nephews and my dad and my whole family picking the vineyard. This is in Lake Elmo, Minnesota, a suburb of the Twin Cities. So I kind of enlist a lot of family and friends to help out with picking. This is the grapes that we get. The green grapes called Edelweiss. It's a grape developed by the University of Minnesota to be highly cold resistant. These can survive temperatures down to -30 Fahrenheit, which is about I think 25 Celsius. They make a good white wine. It's harder to make red wine in Minnesota, but I'm actually figuring out how to make red wine in Minnesota. It's not something that's often done, to be honest, but it's possible. Not easy, but it's possible. I'll share a couple more photos with you. This is an article somebody wrote about me being the Johnny Appleseed of South Minneapolis, which I thought was kind of funny. Here's a picture of Eric, the winemaker. This is what it looks like after we gather apples into a tarp. When we shake the apples off a tree and gather them in a tarp, then put them in a bin, this is what it looks like. We use old recycling bins. When the city of St. Paul, where I live, changed their recycling bins to be essentially a trash bin, all these people in St. Paul had bins that they didn't know what to do with. So I put an ad on Nextdoor and said, I'll come pick them up for free. Give me your bins if you don't want them. So I picked up these bins, and now I have 40 of these heavy duty, strong plastic bins that I can pick apples with. Apples are not the only thing we harvest. These are hot peppers. These are ghost peppers, Bahut peppers. They're actually grown in the yard. Our previous winemaker grew them in his backyard, and then he sold them to me to use in a hot pepper hard cider. This is our previous winemaker, Rob, picking crab apples with us in an orchard in Wisconsin. We picked apples. Unfortunately, I don't have many pictures of the urban foraging we do, because most of our foraging is down in the city, but the prettier orchards are out in the farms, out in the rural areas. So that's where we take the pictures. I'm realizing now I should take more pictures in the city, but I don't really have them. And this brings you back to the farm outside of Twin Cities where we were picking apples. In addition to the things that I forage, apples, pears, cherries, plums, I also buy grapes. I buy grapes from a vineyard in Wisconsin near Hudson, about 30 miles from our winery. I buy black currants from a grower in southern Wisconsin. I buy honey from an apiary in southern Minnesota. And I also buy blueberries from a grower in northern Wisconsin. So while I don't forage everything, I try to source everything locally. If I can't pick it myself, I'll buy it from someone within 150 to 200 miles from me, because I feel like that's important. With that, I think I'll open it up to questions, because I don't think I have much more to say. Well, I could talk for a long time, but I don't think it'd be very interesting. And I'd rather take questions if you have them.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jeff. That's super interesting. And Katie and I can attest that the wine is really good.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, we can jump to the Q&A. Some of it is going to be in French, which Kate will have to answer. This one may be for you, Katie. Avez-vous fait tester le terrain avant de faire pousser des plantes qui seront comestibles?
Ok, I'll unmute myself first. D'accord. Oui, j'ai fait tester le terrain. J'ai amené à l'université de Minnesota, ils ont une test assez simple à faire là-bas. Mais aussi, comme c'était terrain agricole conventionnel avant, enfin, faut que je dise, enfin, celle qui est chez nous, on avait fait tester il y a des années avant, juste pour faire le jardin. Et le terrain à Fuzzy Bottom, enfin le Garden Farm, on avait fait tester, parce qu'on ne connaissait pas, mais la personne qui était propriétaire du terrain, il nous avait dit que c'était dans l'agriculture conventionnelle, donc ça veut dire maïs et puis soja, avec des pesticides et des trucs comme ça pendant au moins 10 ans. Mais les dernières 2 ans avant que nos amis l'ont acheté, il n'a pas utilisé. Donc ils avaient mis, ils avaient planté, ils avaient semé des oats. Je n'ai pas du tout le vocabulaire en français pour les plantes, malheureusement. Mais que, donc, on savait que c'était utilisé au moins pour l'agriculture avant. Malheureusement, pour les pesticides, il faut juste attendre au moins 3 ans avant que ça soit, qu'on soit sûr que c'est clair, quoi, que c'est propre. Voilà.
D'accord.
C'est très long comme réponse.
Merci. I can ask the question to George and Mike too. Did you test your soil before you grew plants?
That's a very good question. We did not. And so because there were 2 reasons we did not test our soil. The first is we had lived here for decades without putting anything bad on the soil. But instead of, what we did is we raised the yard up. The first picture you'll notice was this gentle sloping hunk of grass. We actually installed a retaining wall and then brought in truckloads of fresh organic soil and compost that we covered the top of it with. So we're really growing in that new layer that we put on top. It's sort of like the whole yard is one large raised bed.
Oh, okay, great.
So
the next question is, how do you deal with wildlife like deers or eagles?
I love this topic. I used to work as the clinic coordinator at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center here, so I'm very interested and passionate about the wildlife in our yard. And we worry about predators because of our chickens. You know, we have coyote and fox right near our home.
We have eagles and deer, which I saw in the question. Being so close to the river, we have both of those as
we
well.
have in our oak tree in the backyard, we have a nest of raccoons, which are known to predate on raccoons and are on chickens and chicken eggs. We have all kinds eagles sit in the tree in our backyard. So what we do is to deal with the wildlife that would eat our garden, we let them do it. We say, okay,
plant more.
we say the world is abundant, you can have some. And what we discovered in taking that very gentle approach with wildlife, we started finding ways that we could allow the wildlife to help us. So one of the things that we learned early on was that in our strawberry patch, rabbits love to build their nests in strawberry patches. It's perfect habitat for rabbits to nest. So we would get these constant stream of little baby bunnies being born into our garden, and we didn't want to kill them or do anything bad to them. But we're also sort of lazy gardeners. So we would always have dandelions and a little bit of clover. And we realized one day sitting on the front deck, watching the little baby garden bunnies go up and down the rows, their favorite things to eat were the dandelions and the clover. And so we realized if we didn't pull those things out, they would eat those instead of the kale and the lettuce and the other things. And so it became a way, a whole host of ways of finding ways to coordinate and cooperate with the wildlife in our yard. And so we don't fight with them, with one exception, and that's our green beans. And we fence the beans.
Yeah, because they'll eat the plants. And so fencing is an option.
Yeah. Okay, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I don't know which language to speak in now, but since it was asked in English, I'll go with English. Yeah, I absolutely, the technique of Mike and George is one that at our house, we take that technique too. There's in the city here, there's no way to avoid rabbits and squirrels and all that. So yeah, they eat some of the tomatoes. It's okay.
Bon appetit.
Right. And the rabbits, yeah, there's clover next to it. Yeah, absolutely. They go for those things much more than the other plants. I did at the garden farm, we did put up a deer fence in the very beginning because there are a lot of deer out there, and a small, they basically would have, they'd come out and find it one night and everything that I did would have been gone because they can eat so much. So we put up a deer fence for that. Eventually, I would like to have enough built up around it so that the annual plants towards the center will be protected by other berries and other things that the deer can eat before they get to the stuff that we eat, essentially. That's the idea. I don't know if that'll happen. So there, that's my, I agree completely with the, you just have to deal with it because you're not going to win. So let them have some, and everyone's happy. So,
Okay.
voilà. Je peux le dire en français, mais voilà. Enfin, je pense que tout le monde ici qui parle français, il comprend aussi l'anglais. Donc, ils
Tout
ont
le monde
peut-être-
est bilingue, donc ça va.
Ouais.
Mais en fait, l'idée générale en français, c'est oui, les animaux vont en manger, mais du moment qu'ils mangent pas tout, ça va.
Ouais. Et aussi intégrer les animaux dans le jardin, c'est vraiment génial. C'est comme George et Mike, ils ont parlé des poules. On avait dans l'agriculture, on a séparé les animaux des plantations et c'est vraiment pas un système complet comme ça, c'est pas entier. Les animaux, c'est une partie et ils ajoutent les fertilisants et ils travaillent le terre eux-mêmes. Donc, c'est que ça, nous, on n'a pas besoin de l'élaborer parce qu'eux, ils font les poules et tout. Donc, voilà, il faut les ramener.
Okay, maybe we'll switch to a question for Jeff. So if fruits foraged or neglected by owners, do you have to compensate with additive to deal with disease, bacteria, or undesirable yeast?
Well, yes and no. I most of what I forage is organic by default, I call it. It's not certified organic, but the homeowners haven't sprayed it. I guess you could say it's neglected. Typically not badly diseased. We don't see a whole lot of disease in the fruit we pick, but we're somewhat selective, I guess, about what we pick. I've found that a lot of the fruit grown in the city will have some bird and squirrel. The birds and squirrels will eat some of it. There's not a ton of disease problems. We don't see a lot of scab and a lot of rot, cedar. There's a couple of diseases you find in orchards where there's 1,000 trees, 10,000 trees that aren't typical in a city where there's actually a very biodiverse urban forest in a lot of Minneapolis. So there's actually a lot of beneficial insects that help take out some of the things like, fruit fly, fruit maggots, fruit apple maggots, which are a problem in codling moth, which are a big problem in orchards. You don't see that so much in the city. The apples tend to be smaller. They tend to be somewhat misshapen. They're not perfect, but we don't care because we're making cider out of it. As to whether or not we have to add additives to deal with disease, bacteria, undesirable yeast, I do use some sulfite in my operation, but I use far less than almost anyone else. It's a tool I can use if I need to. I prefer not to use sulfite. I don't like sulfite. My wife is very sensitive to sulfite. She won't drink wine if I put sulfite in it. So I try to avoid it as much as possible. What I've found, the most effective technique I've found in winemaking to deal with wild yeast and bacteria is, number one, to let the wild yeast do its job and add a more aggressive yeast into the mix to outcompete the wild yeast. It also works with bacteria. I use a strain of yeast, EC1118, which is extremely competitive and is tougher than all our Minnesota wild yeast, obviously. So that none of the wild yeast here lasts in the face of this very aggressive yeast. So that will kind of create a colony that the wild yeasts can't compete with. It also produces alcohol very quickly, which also it's an antibacterial. So it'll deal with the bacteria or anything, any undesired growth going on inside the wine or the cider. So I found that's far more effective than adding chemicals. And I just don't like adding chemicals anyway. So I'm kind of glad that that has worked.
Okay, great. Osama, do we want to keep going with questions? Do we need to close? Are we okay going over time?
Yeah, sure. Please continue with the questions.
So the next question was, guess that's a pretty general question. What is the time investment? I don't know who want to answer that.
Well, I can answer for us. We took our project on, you know, bits at a time, and it was a small project, and so we were able to, you know, bite off whatever we wanted to chew at any given time. And what we found is that by eliminating yard maintenance, we used that time to do these other things instead. And so, you know, to me, it didn't feel like an additional time commitment. And in fact, to me, it feels easier once, you know, once the planting's done, and there's oftentimes a more urgent need for weeding earlier on in the season and things. You know, once everything's planted and then initial phase of weeding is done, there's a whole bunch of summer where there's not a lot that needs to get done, but you get to do the fun stuff like go out and eat. And so to me, it just doesn't seem like there's a lot of time. And I think people can start by, you know, starting with a small garden and gradually expanding it. They can choose the amount of time that they want to put into it. From my perspective, it's up to them, each person, how much they want to do and how fast they want to go.
And plant what you like to eat. That's the best incentive for the work that it takes.
Okay. Yeah, it's, I guess the time investment is whatever you want to make it. Okay, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, okay, I'm just gonna keep saying, I totally agree with them. But it is true, it's, for our front yard, when we did that, it was a lot of time investment up front, but the last 2 years I have done almost nothing. I have to prune the trees in, you know, February or March. That takes about a half hour. And otherwise, basically it's picking the strawberries. I have to, you know, kind of pull the mint in and make sure it's behaving and pull it up and just things like that, just a little bit of cleanup. But it's very, very little time at our house, in that front yard garden. And the garden farm is obviously a very different story. It's basically a full-time job. I should say that included with canning all the produce, selling the produce, figuring out how to store it, building things to store it in, blah, blah, blah. That takes a lot of time, especially when you're starting from no knowledge whatsoever, like me. It's taking less time now than it did the first year. So I think it's getting, you know, it gets less and less. So yeah, start small and you can put whatever time you want into it, but definitely start small, because I would not suggest, unless you have a lot of time, starting out with 2/5 of an acre by hand. Unless you can. I mean, like me, I was able to do it, but it's definitely a big time investment for that size.
Okay. The question for Jeff, I guess, is how did you decide to go from a hobby to a business?
How did I decide to go from a hobby to a business? I did want to quickly chime in on that last question and say that foraging, as a forager, when you're picking stuff that other people have grown, it's intensely seasonal, an incredible amount of work in the late summer and the fall. But one great thing about being a forager is other people grow your stuff. Other people grow the food, nature grows the food, and I don't have to maintain it, which is wonderful. So I'm also a gardener. I love to garden, but for our business, I forage most of what except for the grapes, I forage everything we grow, or purchase it, and it's actually quite nice. Although it's an awful lot. In the fall, I'm exhausted every day. If we were doing this in October, I would be probably falling asleep on the table right now. But but Johan, you'd also asked another question. I'm sorry, I forgot what it was already. What was that question again?
So the first question was about wildlife the previous question was about wildlife, like how do you deal with deers and eagles and things like that?
Mm-hmm. How do I deal with deer and eagles? I don't. I let the landowner deal with that. In the case of the vineyard, it's surrounded by a fence that deer can't get over. I put up a balloon covered with eyes for things like or not owls, the starlings, mostly starlings and grackle, that will eat grapes. It's a giant balloon that has eyes printed all over it, and that's actually quite effective at fending off birds. I also have a plastic owl I put up on one of the posts. So that's what I do to keep wild birds out of the vineyard. The deer can't get through the fence. So yeah, beyond that, there's occasionally groundhogs. Fortunately, the owner of the vineyard has a vendetta against groundhogs, so she traps them and takes them away before they have a chance to get close to the grapes.
Okay. The next question, actually, that was the first question. It's in French. Est-ce que les personnes âgées ou les personnes à mobilité réduite, à mobilité réduite, oui, limite, peuvent se lancer dans une permaculture aussi extensive ou cela demande-t-il trop d'efforts physiques?
Can you listen to...
I think it's important. I wanted to translate this question because it's really important as it relates to inclusion and what we are activists for. So how do you think people that are disabled could participate in permaculture given the amount of effort it could potentially need? So yeah, please chime in, any of you.
D'accord, je vais commencer. Ben oui, c'est bien possible. Il y a beaucoup de monde qui font de permaculture, il met dans les lits, enfin dans des carrés élevés. Comme ça, on n'est pas toujours en train de se baisser et tout ça. Donc, il faut juste adapter la situation. Est-ce que ce que moi j'ai fait est vraiment beaucoup d'efforts physiques? Ben oui, la première année, c'était vraiment beaucoup. Mais ça aussi, c'était un choix que j'avais fait parce que je ne voulais pas utiliser trop le tracteur et tous les autres trucs. Donc, c'est possible de commencer et créer le système et d'utiliser les manières moins physiques. Mais après, faire le travail de s'aimer, la récolte et tout ça, c'est possible de le faire. Il faut juste savoir et travailler. Enfin, il faut juste apprendre et trouver qu'est-ce qui marche pour vous, en gros.
Et tous les ans, on a ce qu'on appelle un Harvest Fest, où il y a des gens, des personnes âgées qui viennent et on leur apporte des choses, par exemple des haricots secs à écosser, puis c'est quelque chose qu'ils peuvent faire pendant que nous on récolte.
Ouais, ça c'est un truc qui était bien. On avait fait ça aussi pour partager ça avec la famille, des amis, avoir les gens qui viennent. Et oui, comme on a dit, tout le monde est là. Il y a des tout petits aux plus âgés, et des gens qui n'ont pas la force physique de faire certaines tâches. Il y a des autres tâches. C'est pas difficile à trouver les autres choses pour faire et pour participer, tout le monde.
George and Mike, do you have any experience with aging people or people with disabilities helping on your urban farm?
Not really any direct experience. We are getting older, and I mean that sincerely.
Seriously, yeah.
That as we have gone through this process and aged, we have tried to find equipment, different ways of doing things that work better for us. And so we're always looking for that kind of thing.
And I would argue there's two ways for me to interpret the question. One is the production side of permaculture, but the other side is the benefit side of permaculture. And there's an interesting dynamic going on globally in the field of just local food, permaculture, and all other kinds, which is looking at, you know, community food forests that benefit the entire community regardless of ability, where the community comes together, finds designated local spaces so that anybody with any financial, physical, or other kind of disability or challenge has a food source that's local and available. And so on the benefit side, we all can learn to benefit from it. And I think that if you look at some of the physical structures, I wish I had understood more of Kate's response, but you know, I do know that there's, you know, doing things like raised beds and things can make growing things much more accessible to different kinds of people. And, you know, and in a way, don't want this to be offensive, but every situation, every person has got a challenge when it comes to gardening, and we all need to find our ways of finding ways to growing within the constructs that challenge us. And part of the joy of gardening is overcoming those challenges. And so I just encourage people to give it a try and see if they can figure it out. Look at what their challenge is and look for ways to overcome it. And I think that can be rewarding so much in and of itself.
I would probably add to that too, that nobody in an urban area like ours, nobody has to do it alone either. We have developed relationships because of the gardening that we're doing with people around us. And so we're able to help each other. And so there are ways to network with the people around you, and that can provide even the incentive to seek out and connect with people who are kind of like-minded around gardening and wanting to do something different with their yard space.
And there's also people who are getting together. Until one of our neighbors recently moved to the Bering Strait of Alaska, but before then there was this collection of neighbors who got together and did their own sort of community gardening in their own yards, and they split up the tasks based on ability and preference. And so, you know, one person didn't like to go outside so much, but was comfortable sitting. So they did all of the sitting at the table, putzing with the pots and the planting of the seeds, while other people who liked to dig more and do the heavy lifting did that stuff. And there's all kinds of ways people can share responsibilities based on interest and ability. And I think it's a fun way to garden, because then gardening also becomes about building community, not just growing stuff.
Okay, thanks a lot, everyone. I think we're way over time, so I think we're going to close. Usama?
Yeah, so as a closing word, I just wanted to thank you all for coming and sharing your beautiful experiences and profiles and endeavors with us. It is always a pleasure to host those webinars around ideas and values that we cherish. Encore une fois, merci à toutes et à tous qui sommes venus nous rejoindre pour ce webinaire. N'hésitez pas à nous contacter, à nous suivre sur les réseaux sociaux. On est toujours, notre porte est toujours ouverte. Et puis on vous dit à très bientôt pour un nouveau webinaire et du nouveau contenu. Encore merci et puis thank you all and till the next time. Bye.